I will now read the University of Iowa Acknowledgement of Land and Sovereignty. The University of Iowa is located on the homelands
of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, Bahoji,
Iowa,
Kickapoo,
Kickapoo,
Omatmanewak,
Menominee,
Miamika,
Miami,
Natuchi,
Missouri,
Omaha,
Omaha,
Wazaji,
Osage,
Jaware,
Oto,
Odawa,
Ottawa,
Ponca,
Ponca,
Potawatomi, Nishnawbe,
Potawatomi,
Nishquaki, Nemahaki, Sakawaki, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Sanish, Nubaga, Nuweta.
and the Ho-Chunk Nations.
The following tribal nations: the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, Ponca Tribe of Nebraska, Sac and Fox Nation of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska, continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them.
As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations,
and the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations, and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847.
consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do.
Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations.
Today is I'm Lauren Lessing, I'm the director of the Stanley Art Museum. I think I know most of you, but welcome here. The very first public presentation that we've had in this visual classroom. So it's a real pleasure to welcome today Dr. Randall Griffey. I've known him for many years. We worked together on a project to document and publish the American paintings at the Nelson Atkins Museum back in the early 2000s. And subsequent to that, Randy has been a curator of American painting at the Mead Art Museum at Amherst University. He went from there to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where as a curator, he curated the exhibition Alice Neel, People Come First, and he's now the head curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So it's a real pleasure to welcome, and of course we have one of the paintings that was in that exhibition on loan to us from the TIA Foundation. It now is at the entry point to our inaugural exhibition, Homecoming. And that loan was made manifest by our own senior curator, Stanley, so who's also here. So please join me in welcoming Randall Griffey.
Thank you, Lauren. I just would be remiss to not say, to slightly embarrass Lauren in public to start. Because she is one of my favorite human beings. And I'm so pleased to see the outcome of her work and the work of so many people in this room and beyond to bring this amazing university collection back to the public after such a long period of deprivation. I had seen the collection back in the 90s during my one and only previous trip through Iowa City. I have very vague memories of that, but I, like so many others who knew the collection, just my heart sank at the, I guess sinking is not a great thing. Well, let me try that again. My heart broke when I read about the flood. That was also heartened that no art was lost or anything worse than that, and that like it felt like a long time coming, and just to see outcome here, and that one of my favorite people played a part in that. It's just incredibly gratifying. So there, you're publicly humiliated just a little bit. Was it soon after the new year when Laura and I were catching up, as we often do? She said, "I'm having you out to Iowa to speak this spring." I said, "Okay." And she said, "We're having on loan for long-term loan, Alice Neel's The Black Boys from the Tia collection." And I said, "Really?" I was like, "What? How are you doing that?" Anyway, there's a great story there, as there often is around Alice Neel's work. As Lauren mentioned, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to co-curate with my friend and colleague, Kelly Baum, who is the recently announced new director of the Des Moines Art Center. So Kelly just had her going out, her departure party at the Metropolitan yesterday, and is packing up and moving to Des Moines. So Iowa is gaining some just top-notch museum personnel at the very highest level. So just and also I've been waiting for years to bring Kelly and Lauren together. So now they're going to be stirring up trouble from these two amazing art museums in the state. So Kelly and I had the opportunity to co-curate the show, which became known as Alice Neel, People Come First. The subtitle is drawn from quotes that Neel gave in an interview in 1950. So those are some words coming through. There's more to say about that, but that's not really why we're here. But I just, the opportunity to speak about, okay, this isn't fancy. But this gave me opportunity to take a little trip down memory lane, because this, as it turned out to be my last, I guess, kind of my swan song at the Met after 8.5 years. And so felt like I ended on a high note here. Working with Kelly was a dream. And this show, this retrospective with Neel, and that really blew up. It's hard to go wrong with Neel under any circumstances, but this show opened and ran through the summer of 2021, just as the city was reopening, just as the Met was reopening a bit more. So it was quite exciting to see people queue up under very kind of constrained, circumscribed circumstances to have entry into the museum, wearing masks, and then to engage in Neel's images of people. Neel didn't like to call her work portraits. She said she did pictures of people, which is something we can talk a little more about later. But to see more or less New Yorkers queue up to the show that became, in a way, in circumstances, a love letter to New York, and a kind of testament to the endurance of the inhabitants of New York we're showing back without wearing masks in those images. So in the foreground are on the left, seated with the beret is Hartley Neel, the fourth of Neel's 4 children, 2 daughters, 2 sons. To his side is Jenny Neel, his wife. They are ostensibly the heads of the Neel estate. We worked very closely with them on the show, and this was their. I was reading them outside, and taking in Jeff and Brian as the kind of poster boys for the show on the Met's facade. I would love to have kept one of those big banners, but there were kind of no place to put it. But this was a great moment just before going in and watching the show. Yeah, and this opening image, this is the first thing you see coming in. Margaret Evans, pregnant, from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston. Kelly and I, we worked together so well, and basically had no fights about anything. And you never hear that when curators get together. That we're like, what's on the opening wall? We're like, oh, yeah, Margaret Evans pregnant, it's definitely on the opening wall. So anyway, spectacular sideline. And like I said, the show really blew up. So this is Roberta Smith's write-up saying it's time to put Alice Neel in the rightful place in the Pantheon. Neel has always been a bit of an oddball with regard to the history of 20th century art, because she adamantly did not capitulate to isms. So beyond the 1930s, when you could say she was a quasi-social realist, I guess, beyond that, she really didn't abide by prevailing isms of her day. And also the fact that she lived after 1938, she was living uptown in Spanish Harlem, and then in the late 1960s, as we'll talk about, moved up to the upper West Side. She was at some physical remove as she was aging from the centers of the New York art world, which also played a part in her being marginalized in addition to her gender. And of course, I tracked the reception of this like hawk, including on social media, and just love some of these responses about, you know, the genius of Alice Neel was cathartic, raw, human-centric joy. This is fantastic. Irene Peslickis, sort of old Marxist girl, stopped a lot of folks in their tracks. This for me is one of the most amazing images captured on social media. This mother running to the Neel show to expressly to breastfeed her child in this gallery we devoted to her exploration of the theme of motherhood, and many of these mothers are breastfeeding. So this is pretty powerful. And it's just, I think partly again, the effective Neel is that she makes you feel seen in different ways. Even if of course you're not ostensibly the sitter she's painting, you feel seen in a range of ways. And these are images of the last weekend. Here I am, Laura in the corner, all masked up with Margaret Evans pregnant. Behind me, Kelly and I often joked throughout the show because we did hundreds of tours. When the museum was closed, we could offer up private walkthroughs, and we did, I mean, between Kelly and me and development colleagues, I think we tallied over 300 walkthroughs of the show. So we joked that this must be what it feels like to be curators in the Costume Institute, because it felt like we had curated Alexander McQueen or something like that, because we had a trail down the Rodin corridor all the way around the mezzanine around Great Hall. One of the highlights of the walkthroughs we had is actually to meet a number of Neel's sitters. And so here's Julie and Algis. Of course, I felt like I knew Julie pretty well before meeting her in this instance. Meeting Neel's sitters who are still with us and to get their recollections and circumstances of the sitting. In this case, Neel painted Julie and Algis. Algis, who's the boyfriend and the father of their child, forthcoming, was a friend of Carter's, the son that we saw at the front. They were med school students together in Berkeley. So this was a painting Neel did visiting Hartley and Ginny out in Berkeley in the late 60s. This also was, I mean, this maybe was the takeaway. Well, it's hard to pick, but here's on the right, Carmen Encarnacion, who is the figure on the left of MFA Boston's stunning Neel double portrait of two girls, Spanish Harlem. So this is her and her now deceased sister sitting for Neel. So they were neighbors of Neel during her time living and working in Spanish Harlem, the period between 1938 and the late 60s. And in the foreground is the artist Miguel Luciano, who was our conduit to a number of folks he knew in Spanish Harlem, and he helped to arrange our meeting, Carmen, who interestingly kind of schooled us. Because the label for this picture, we did perpetuate some of the language that is existing around Neel's time in Spanish Harlem, about Neel's empathy for the plight of the residents of Spanish Harlem, who were predominantly Black, Dominican, and Puerto Rican, and this presumption that the neighborhood of Spanish Harlem was ravaged by disease and poverty. And Carmen took to task on that. And she said, we never felt sick, we never felt poor, we never felt unsafe. And so we actually took that to heart and back and modified the language. And then as the show went on to other institutions, made sure that they modified the language around that we had inherited and perpetuated around the Spanish Harlem context. She also corrected something that we successfully corrected beyond, which is this was a loan from the Tate Gallery. The Tate has two great Alice Neels, one very early nude, which we had, and in this picture, which was known to us, known to the world up until recently as Dominican Boys on 108th Street. Carmen knew these kids, and she told us during that visit that you saw, she said those kids were not Dominican, they were very Puerto Rican. And so I tracked down information, I took down notes and followed up on information she gave us, and then I found these kids in Ancestry, and indeed they're Puerto Rican. So this is, and in fact, you see Jose Felipe, who was, his nickname was Monty, which is, she said they were Papo and Monty. You see Felipe is kind of scrawled on a little bit of graffiti over his head. So we successfully lobbied with we approached the Tate with this information, and they formally changed the title. So Neel's titles is actually a topic maybe we can talk a little bit about, because you can see that there's a pattern where Neel doesn't, partly because Neel didn't think of her practice as portrait painting per se, she didn't typically identify her sitters by name. So they tend to have these more generic titles. Some of them, like the Black Boys, frankly, get into areas that are a little bit problematic, and that we grappled with in the context of the show. So what is true is Neel tended not to name her sitters by name and her titles, because she thought of them as pictures of people. She actually thought of them as history painting in history painting in the time. But what is also true is that there's inconsistency, is that these titles have changed in certain instances as pictures have changed hands. For instance, we have no idea how this picture became known as Dominican Boys. I mean, where that error was made. Although we did try to find out, and we never determined it, but at least we were able to correct it. So I had to think that as Neel was embarking on the picture that we know as the Black Boys, that perhaps she was harkening back to Puerto Rican boys about 10 years earlier. Now, by this point, painting Black Boys, she had moved across town from Spanish Harlem to the Upper West Side. So it's in the late 60s where she leaves her beloved Spanish Harlem and begins years living in a very different environment and under very different circumstances. So we're going to talk a little bit about the circumstances under which yes, she met these two young boys, not quite yet men. In this picture that you're, again, this is so wonderful, you're someone from the Tia collection for, I guess, a year. So there's a lot to say here, and I'll click through a few slides to give this a little bit of context. So, like I said, by this point, Neel has just uprooted from the, see if the pointer works, from Spanish Harlem. So she's over here, and now she is up over here. This is actually where she's living. So those of you familiar with this part of New York, this is Columbia. So she's just below Columbia University, the Columbia's lawn with the very famous libraries up here. Neel's apartment where she was living and working and painting. Toby and Jeff Neel, the sitters by name, is here, and it's still actually owned by the family. And one of the ways in which COVID disrupted Kelly and our work on the Neel shows that we were hoping to get in to the apartment to go through to the pilfer Neel's library in the apartment, which is still intact. But due to COVID, we had to delay that experience because the Neel family wasn't coming into New York as they normally do. The Neel family still owns that spot. So here is a period photograph of Neel. I love this photograph. It tells you so much about Neel. Of course, it's posed. This is for a Time Life feature. But what it tells, and this is by this point, this is your granddaughter, Olivia. You can see she's poring over the New York Times. She was, an avid consumer of news and, was very up to date on current events and had strong opinions about things going on. But you see her surrounded by her art. So there's Jeff and Brian, who saw us, a marquee image for the Met show. here. But what it tells you to some extent is that Neel was always living and working and painting at home. And that was true throughout the entirety of her career. But by this point in her apartment in the Upper West Side, she has a lot more room. So her work begins to grow in scale. So, she's a bit like a, I don't know, goldfish. Is there some sort of goldfish that gets bigger the more leaves? I don't know. It's like that. But so it's, her early work in the 30s is very modest in scale. But by this point, she can start thinking about going big. And you start to see that growth in scale in the picture from the TIA Foundation. She's starting to kind of, have a little more elbow room. And so the work is beginning to grow. So there are views of the apartment. It's just like, if people always wonder and love for it to open as an artist's studio apartment, but it is still a functioning apartment building, and so it could never be coded in that way. And there is the library intact that Kelly and I were really wanting to get through. There's everything from Marx and Engels' Das Kapital in there to the collection catalog for the Witches by Kansas Museum of Art. So, incredible kind of insight into her depth and breadth of knowledge and interests. And the furniture becomes, kind of recurring protagonists in so many of her pictures. And in many instances, you can, I gave a talk actually in West Palm Beach about a sitter who was clearly sitting on that chair that is tucked away in a different room now. One of the frustrating things though about, I'll go down that road in a minute. So continuing on this storyline of just these amazing experiences of meeting some of Neel's sitters, is that we conspired in a way to reunite Jeff Neel, who's the sitter on the left, in the picture known as the Black Boys, shown with his now deceased brother Toby, sitting in Neel's Upper West Side apartment. This was an incredible opportunity. Our communications department worked with the New York Times, and we did this interview with Jeff because he'd actually never seen the final picture. He'd never seen it. He had no idea where it went, where he did it up. And beyond that, he'd actually never been to the Met before. So it was extremely powerful, and again, then segues into issues around institutional accessibility and barriers to these institutions like the Met from lifelong New Yorkers like Jeff Neel. So, but what is true is that his first trip to the Met was to see his portrait on our walls. It was pretty great. So here's how the story ran in Times. I encourage you to look it up. It's an incredible read. But long story short is that Hartley Neel, who was the fourth of Neel's four kids, was friends with this man Tobias Allen. And Tobias, who was part of the kind of consortium of figures who brought Jeff brought Jeff into the museum for this story and for this encounter. Tobias was a bit of a mentor for Jeff and Toby as they were kids. So it's not exactly like a big brother situation. It wasn't that formal, but he was a kind of elder mentor to them and friend. So Tobias knew through Hartley that that Hartley's father was a painter and who painted also children. So those were circumstances under which Jeff and Toby came in 1967 for, I think, multiple sittings. These pictures look like they are dashed off in certain ways, but they are actually products of quite laborious and multiple sittings. And there's a more, well, he just had shoulder surgery. So we helped him take his brace off with a formal portrait that ran at the Times. And so here he is giving a little bit of oral history. And for me, the most amazing, one of the many anecdotes is that Alice Neel gave them prunes for snacks. So like they were, I think if they look a little bit deflated, you know, it's the snacks often were not really great. Just prunes, come on, Alice. I mean, obviously you don't want to give these kids a bunch of sugar, but come on, you could do better than prunes. So anyway, it was, you know, he was very soft-spoken, very self-possessed, and but it was clearly moving for him to be, especially I think in the absence of his brother, to come back in contact with this work that, you know, took him back to a certain point in time. So I was very fortunate. The show traveled. It closed at the Met and then went to the Guggenheim Bilbao. And so this gave me the opportunity. Actually, I've never been to Bilbao before. And this is the opening wall, the Bilbao. The center, that's right in the middle of the walls, the first thing we saw when we walked into the installation. Incredibly powerful. And in fact, the first wall are all subjects from Spanish art. Including, you can see the newly retitled Puerto Rican voice on the far right-hand side. So they were actually on the same wall together, and then also traveled to San Francisco, which was the final venue for the exhibition. And I'm so pleased that actually this picture is not, because Neel has kept on going. There's Pompidou did another Alice Neel show, was not a venue of our show, they retooled it a bit. And then the Barbican in London has a current Neel show, which is actually growing up in London, not unlike Neel grew up in New York. But I'm so actually happy that the Tina picture is not in London, so it could be here in Iowa instead. So that's really all I have by the way of slides, and it gives us some time to go downstairs to talk a little bit more. There's so much to say about the picture formally, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to give you a few of the contextual, a bit of more context and some of the images that wrap around and inform this picture, I think, in a meaningful way. So on that note, should we go down?
Let's go down to the second floor.